In this video, we're going to review the unit circle. And the unit circle is just a circle that has a radius of 1. The word unit means 1. So let's go ahead and make a note of that. The word unit means 1, so the radius is 1. And what you see right here is our two axes, our x-axis and our y-axis. So we're actually going to be looking at this circle on the coordinate plane. Now, what does this have to do with trig? Well, when you look at these two axes, they intersect and form this 90-degree angle. And so what we're going to do is we're going to rotate angles around the x and y axis, which is going to essentially form this unit circle. Because if we start here at x, if we call this 0 degrees, then we rotate up 90 degrees to the y-axis. We can label that 90 degrees. From 90 degrees, if we rotate again another 90 degrees, that makes 180 degrees. So that means your x-axis is that complete straight angle, 180 degrees. Then from 180, we rotate another 90. 180 plus 90 makes this 270 degrees. And then if we rotate from 270 back up to the x-axis, that's another 90 degrees, and 270 plus 90 puts us at 360, full circle. So 0 degrees and 360 degrees, those are in the same spot. All right, now those are just my symbols for rotating some angles. Now what we also want to do is include the radian measure. So up here I'm also going to say, okay, 0 degrees in radians is just 0, and 90 degrees is pi over 2, and 180 is pi, and 270 is 3 pi over 2, and 360 is just 2 pi. So I have it up here in degrees and radians. And so the unit circle is a circle with a radius of 1, and we have these very important quadrant angles. Okay, we call them quadrants because they're not in a quadrant, but they form these quadrants. Remember, quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So these are 4 more special angles. In the previous video, we discussed 45-45 90 triangle and 30-60 90 triangle. Those were important angles. You're going to add these angles to your stack of important angles. So let's get our circle over here. And that looks about right. And it's the unit circle because this is the center and the radius goes out 1 unit. So that makes our radius. And because we went 1 unit to the right, that would be the ordered pair 1, 0, because it's just on the x-axis. We didn't go up or down, we just went to the right. If we go back to the center and we go draw the radius from the center to the 90 degrees, right here, it just went up 1 unit. So that would be the ordered pair 0, 1. It didn't go left or right, it just went up 1 unit. Starting back at the center, if we go left 1 unit, then that would be the ordered pair -1, 0. Because we went to the left of 0 on the x-axis, so that's why it's -1. Start at the center. If we go down 1 unit, then that would be the ordered pair 0, -1. And then back around to 360, we've already got that, it's 1, 0. So we went right 1, up 1, left 1, and down 1, and it's a unit circle, and so the radius is 1. So if you can keep these values in mind, we can use this information to find the function values, the trig function values for these quadrant angles. Now, the quickest way to do this, and you want the quickest because you're on the ACT, it's a time test. The quickest way to do this is to keep in mind that the x values, they represent cosine. And the y values represent sine. Now this comes from the x and y definitions that you learned in your trig class at the beginning. You probably learned your xy definitions, xyr definitions before you did opposite, hypotenuse, adjacent. Okay? Now, we're not going to take it all the way back to those definitions, but we're just going to keep in mind that x represents cosine and y represents sine. And you might be thinking, well, what about tangent? Well, if you remember your ratio definition, the tangent is equal to sine over cosine. So it's always all about sine and cosine. Okay, so if we want to use this information, let's practice a few things. Let's say I asked you to find the sine of pi over 2. Okay, well, sine of pi over 2, that's the same thing as 90 degrees, so that means we're right here. Sine is the y value, so the sine of 90 degrees is just 1. Okay, say I asked you to find the cosine of 90 degrees. Well, let's go find 90 degrees on the circle. 90 degrees is right here. We're in the same spot. Cosine is the x value, and the cosine of 90 degrees is 0. And then let's say I asked you to find the tangent of 90 degrees. Okay, well, tangent isn't represented by x or y, but it's represented by sine over cosine. Sine over cosine right here. So the sine of 90 is 1, and the cosine of 90 is 0. 1 divided by 0, that means the tangent of 90 is undefined. It just does not exist. So you can go through and do this with all 4 or 5, if you want to call it 5, quadrant angles. 0 and 360 are in the same spot. So let's do a few more. Make sure we got the hang of this, because these are very common. And let's find the sine of pi. All right, let me scroll back up just a little bit more so you can see the majority of that circle. All right, so sine of pi, that's 180 degrees. And remember, sine is the x. Sine is the, not x, sine is the y value. And that y value is 0, so the sine of pi is 0. Sine of pi is 0. And let's go ahead and do cosine of pi. Well, cosine is the x. That's kind of easy to remember because x comes before y alphabetically, and the c in cosine comes before s in sine alphabetically. So that might be a good way for you to remember. X represents cosine and y represents sine. So over here, looking at the x coordinate, the cosine of pi is -1. Let's go ahead and do tangent while we're here. The tangent of pi is going to be sine 0 over cosine -1. 0 divided by anything is 0. So the tangent of pi, or the tangent of 180, is 0. Okay, so what are we going to do? What if the angle isn't one of those quadrant angles? What if it's not 0, 90, 180, 270, or 360? Well, it's not going to be too hard. We're going to keep in mind the quadrant angles though, and I'm going to redraw my x and y axis. And I'm going to review some SIGNs, those kind of signs. And you probably remember from your trig class the phrase, all students take calculus. Okay? And we're going to put the A, the S, the T, and the C in these quadrants. There's your x-axis, there's your y-axis. Quadrant 1 is going to be an A. Quadrant 2 is going to be an S. Quadrant 3 is T, and quadrant 4 is C. All students take calculus. Now, what that means, what do we use this for? Well, we use this because we need to know the SIGNs of the trig functions in those particular quadrants. So in quadrant 1, that means that in quadrant 1, all the trig function values are positive. Okay, so the A stands for all the trig: sine, cosine, tangent, cosecant, secant, cotangent. In quadrant 2, sine is positive, and then also its reciprocal, cosecant. Okay, so if it's not positive, it's negative. So if I have an angle that lies in quadrant 2 and I want to know the tangent, well, then it's going to have a negative value. We're going to use this in a minute to find some function values. In quadrant 3, the T stands for tangent, so that means tangent is positive in quadrant 3 and its reciprocal cotangent. So if it's not positive, it has to be negative. And then in quadrant 4, cosine. Cosine is positive, and therefore secant is positive. So we're going to use this to find the function values for angles that are not quadrant angles. Let's look at an example. Let's find the exact value. And let's find the exact value for the sine of 5 pi over 6. Okay, so I'm going to give you some steps for this. First, you probably want to go ahead and convert radians to degrees. Let's convert radians to degrees. So remember, pi is equal to 180. So if we plug that in, that's 5 times 180 over 6, which is going to be 150 degrees. So we're actually just finding the sine of 150. Now I have you convert it to degrees because my second step is for you to draw a sketch. So we want to sketch the angle. So let's go ahead and just draw an XY axis. This is 0 degrees, this is 90 degrees, this is 180, and we want an angle that measures 150. And so we start here on the positive x-axis, and 150 is probably right about here. And the reason why we need to sketch it is because we need to determine what quadrant this angle lies in. So we need to determine the sign, the SIGN. And because it's in quadrant 2, remember, all students take calculus, sine is positive in quadrant 2. So the sine of 150 is going to have a positive value. Then we have to find what's called the reference angle. And so the reference angle is always in reference to the x-axis. And so our reference angle here is 30 degrees because our triangle that we can form is right here. The triangle lies in quadrant 2, which is another way to think about it. And if you say 180 minus 150, that gives me a reference angle of 30. So step 4 is going to be to determine the value using a special right triangle. Determine the value using a special right triangle. I'm abbreviating special right triangle. Now, because I found the reference angle of 30 degrees, that means I need to use a 30, 60, 90 triangle. Now, this is the triangle I memorized with 60 at the bottom, 30 at the top, and 1, 2, square root of 3. So when I'm looking for the sine of 5 pi over 6, I'm really finding the sine of 150, which is really like finding the sine of 30 degrees. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so opposite of 30 is 1 over the hypotenuse is 2, and we said this is positive because we're in quadrant 2. So the sine of 5 pi over 6 is just 1/2. Okay, so 4 simple steps. I went through that one kind of slow just to make sure you understood the steps. We're going to convert to radians to degrees. We're going to draw a quick sketch so we know what quadrant we're in. That quadrant is going to determine the SIGN. Is this a positive value or a negative value? And then we're going to use one of our special right triangles to find the actual function value. Let's try another one. Let's find the tangent of 3 pi over 4. All right, so step 1, we're going to convert to radians. So remember that pi is equal to 180. So that's 3 times 180 over 4, which gives us 135. So we're looking at an angle that measures 135 degrees. Second step is we want to draw a little sketch. So draw your X and Y axis. This is 0 degrees right here. This is 180 degrees. And we want to draw an angle that measures 135. We're only drawing a sketch because we want to know what quadrant the angle lies in. So we draw that, and it's probably right about here somewhere, and that lands me in quadrant 2. Okay, and so essentially what just happened is now if we drop that perpendicular, there's a triangle there. And what triangle is it? It's the 45, 45, 90 triangle, because if you take 180 and subtract 135, that gives you 45 degrees as your reference angle. So your reference angle tells you which triangle to draw. So let's draw the 45, 45, 90, 1, 1, square root of 2. Now, once we've drawn the sketch, which was step 2, we need to determine if it's positive or negative. And so if you remember, all students take calculus. That'll help you figure out the SIGN. We're over here in quadrant 2. That's where our angle is. And the only thing that's positive in quadrant 2 is sine and cosecant. So tangent is going to be negative. It's going to have a negative value. So let's go ahead and put our negative up there. Tangent is defined as opposite over adjacent. So opposite of 45 degrees is 1 and adjacent is 1. So the tangent is negative 1. The tangent of 3 pi over 4 is negative 1. It's really important to remember that the reason why it has a negative value is because the angle lies in quadrant 2. Okay, I've got one more for you. Let's do cosine of 4 pi over 3. All right, first thing we want to do is let's convert radians, 4 pi over 3, to degrees. So 4 times 180 over 3 gives me 240 degrees. Second thing we want to do is draw a sketch. Here's 0, here's 180, here's 270. So let's draw a sketch of 240. 240 is actually going to rotate all the way into quadrant 3. So we're in quadrant 3, and we remember all students take calculus. So in quadrant 3, tangent's positive, which means cosine is negative. So we need to go ahead and slap a negative sign up there. Now we also need to find the reference angle. So that rotated 240 degrees. The reference angle is always in reference to the x-axis. So your right triangle is over here this time. So we're going to subtract 240, take away 180. The reference angle is always going to be positive. That gives me a reference angle of 60 degrees. So I know I need my 30, 60, 90 triangle, 60 at the bottom, 30 at the top, 1, 2, square root of 3, and cosine is defined as adjacent over hypotenuse. So next to 60 or adjacent to 60 is 1, hypotenuse is 2, so the cosine of 4 pi over 3 is negative 1/2. And remember, it's negative because the angle lies in quadrant 3. So you've got 4 steps listed right here. Let's go back a few slides. Convert radians to degrees, draw a sketch so you can determine the sine, then draw the special right triangle and you can find your value.